Welcome to Substack Live today. I'm going to be talking about my upcoming class called Travel Writing with Heart. And I'm also going to be talking about travel writing in general and giving you a little bit of a lesson about it today. But first, a little bit about who I am. So, I've been writing about travel for about 35 years. I began way back in the 90s as an editor at Outside Magazine, which was quite a magazine at the time. And I started out as a junior editor and worked my way up to senior editor, and spent a lot of time working with some of the best travel and adventure writers in the country. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about storytelling and uh, and about what adventure is and how to tell a great adventure story. And then I went out on my own. Most magazines back in the day didn't have staff writers, and so you kind of had to leave the magazine to go out and live the life of a travel writer. And so that's what I did. And over the next 15 years or so, I worked for many different top magazines, including the New York Times and Newsweek and GQ, Wired, of course, Outside still, National Geographic Adventure, and I had quite a nice career. And I traveled all over the world doing this, and uh, and eventually I landed into book editing and memoir writing. But I also then wrote my own memoir. It's a travel memoir essentially, but also a memoir about recovery, and that was called Into the Soul of the World, and that came out in 2023. So I've been doing this a long time, and as you know, I write The Seeker here on Substack, and today I wanted to just sort of dive in and talk about kind of what the distinction between, you know, what makes for a great travel essay versus just sort of mundane travel writing. And I think we've all seen and read kind of that bad travel writing, form, where the plane lands and then we're with them and they check into the hotel and then they go see the major sites and they press the bed and see how firm it is, all that kind of stuff. And those stories aren't that engaging, and we'd also they don't move us emotionally. And so, to write a great travel essay, something has to happen. And of course, something needs to happen in the external world. It doesn't need to be, something dramatic like getting thrown into prison or anything like that. It could be, just a glance from somebody in some important place. But there's also, so that's the external part of it, but there's also the internal part where something has to change within you. And so in a good travel piece, there are essentially two stories going on. There's the external story, um, where you arrive and move through the physical world of space and time. And then there's the internal story of you arrive with certain expectations, with certain desires, certain things you want to have an outcome happen, and something shifts. And by the end, you realize that maybe that something that you didn't quite expect happened to you inside, and you walk away with new questions about a place. Maybe your assumptions have been shattered. So you leave the place changed. So um, I'll give you an example of a particular story that I wrote several years ago. I spent 5 weeks in Palestine in the West Bank. And this is before the most recent wars that have been going on. But I went over there to see for Newsweek magazine, and they assigned me this piece. Can you be a tourist in the West Bank? And so I could have written that classic boring story where I land and I take a car over to the West Bank and I go to the major religious sites. I go to Bethlehem, the Church of the Nativity, maybe go down to the Jordan River, where some of these religious and traditional Christian sites are. Maybe float on the Dead Sea. Do those kind of classic things, and then talk about a hotel I stayed in, and again, press the bed, see how firm it is, and then hit send and send it in. But that's not really what makes for a good travel essay. So when I went to Palestine, I focused on trying to see all sides of it, to see kind of lift the hood up and see what's really going on. And so I start the piece on a rooftop in a small village with a family, and we've been just had iftar. It's during Ramadan. We've had a big meal, and now we're sitting on the rooftop, and I see the glow of Jerusalem in the background, and we're smoking shisha, the hookah, and sharing candies and getting to know this family that I've been staying with there. And it's an amazing experience. They're beautiful people. It's a beautiful meal. I'm really getting to see a side of Palestine that you don't see in the news. And so, and then I connect with my guide and Tamer. He is one of the family members, and we ended up going down to rent a car, and so that's the first big scene I write about. And it's kind of a funny scene because, you know, they need my license, my New Mexico license, and all of this. And Tamer is kind of laughing at me the whole time, and I expect he's going to drive because he knows Palestine. But the truth is, he's always planning on having me drive and on these treacherous roads back there. So I introduced Tamer as this character, and he becomes quite a foil for me, kind of almost a comic foil, as well as a very endearing leader through some pretty edgy situations. Um, Over the course of the piece, we end up going to a refugee camp. We do hit some of the major sites, but I really focus on trying to get underneath it, and eventually I land in the shadow of the separation wall. I'm just outside of Bethlehem. And I have an experience there. I feel the coolness of the air. I feel the chill of the separation wall, and I feel empathy for both sides in this conflict, and just have a lot of uh, deep gratitude and empathy for this experience that I'm having also in this very difficult, war torn, conflict ridden country. And eventually, I look over and I see a graffiti on the wall that says, "Once you have seen, now you're responsible." And it doesn't matter what side you're on or anything. I have friends on both sides of the wall, and yet I have an incredible experience there, seeing that once I have seen this part of the world, I have a responsibility to share it and to share it with empathy. And so I have this deep feeling, this change happen inside me. So that's kind of an example of how I viewed a particular story. And it's very, very different than just, which hotels you stayed at and what major sites you went to. So, how I think about this, and as I said earlier on, there's this external journey and the internal journey. Well, there's a couple of questions that I sort of I want to give you, and they're questions that I keep in mind when I'm writing a travel story. The first question is, what did I think I was going to this place for? What did I expect, and what did I desire to have happen? And then the second question is, what actually happened to me? What happened to me in the external world? And then what happened to me in the internal world, in my internal world? How did I go through something that changed? And the third question is, what questions did I come home with? What new realizations, lessons learned, but really more than lessons learned, what questions did I arrive back home carrying and felt, you know, stimulated by, maybe even troubled by? And so those are three great questions that you can take into your own travel writing. So what I want to do now, though, is I want to tell you about this upcoming class that's happening. And it's happening in September and October. It begins September 14th, and it runs on 4 consecutive Mondays at noon Mountain Time. So that's 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll work on several different things. But like I did today, we'll talk about how to find the deeper meaning in a story. We'll talk about how to pay attention like a really good travel writer. We'll talk, of course, about scenes and character and dialogue and adding sensory detail. And also, just being writing with kind of humility and curiosity rather than kind of a bull in the china shop kind of way that some of us can travel through the world. We'll also talk about how to weave this outer journey with the inner journey. And finally, in the last session, we'll spend some time talking about some of the publishing realities of travel writing, how you can find places where you can get your travel writing published, how you do that, and finally shaping your piece ultimately for publication, if that's what you want. Um, and like I said, you will be leaving this class with a finished travel essay. And last, we'll also be talking a little bit about travel memoir and how to conceive of and think about and maybe finally write that travel memoir you've been thinking about. So I'm going to put the registration uh, in the link in the chat here. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that. Um, and And then I want to give you an assignment. So I want to give you assignment to do some writing on your own, and kind of give you a taste of what this work we'll be doing together is. So here's the prompt I want to give you. You know, think about a trip you've been on, and kind of really ground into your body about this, and sort of like, what's the feeling you have about this place? And then ask yourself, I thought I was going there for this reason. This is why I thought I was going here. What I didn't know yet was blank. And I want you to write then now as after we hang up here. I want you to write for 15 minutes and just sort of ground into this place. I want you to think about who the characters you met were. Is there anybody that said something to you that changed you? Was there any specific sight or experience while you were there that began to change you? And then I want you to think on the other side of that about you know about any realizations or questions that you ended up walking away with. So that's kind of your assignment for today. Um, this is kind of a little bit briefer than I thought. I want to give you those details again about the class. So we begin on September 14th, and we meet 4 consecutive Mondays, and we'll meet at noon Mountain Time, which is my time, but that's 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's called Travel Writing with Heart. And as I said, we'll go into finding the deeper story, writing about characters, paying a deep attention, writing scenes, all the stuff I mentioned that we'll go deep into, and you'll walk away with a finished travel essay, and also some information about how to publish it, and maybe you have the dream of writing a travel memoir someday, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. So um, I hope this answers some of your questions about the class. If you do have questions, you can always reach out to me through the seeker here, through the chat, and I'd love to answer them. I couldn't figure out how to type the link in here, so if you go to my Substack website, it will be there on the first page. There's also a recent post about the class that has all the details about it with the link, and I look forward to hearing from you.